think we are live now.
Awesome. Great.
All right.
So I guess we'll wait a couple minutes until folks come on in.
Yes. And I'm not quite sure how that will go, whether I will get a notification that they're trying to get in, hopefully.
Sure. Or I think people can just watch.
Oh, but then how? So then they can't ask us questions? Like they won't appear like
submit comments though.
Oh, okay.
As you can see, gentle viewer, Arshia and I are mere Facebook Live novices, but we hope this will be the beginning of a fruitful relationship with the platform.
Absolutely. Well, great.
What have you been reading lately, Arshia?
What have I been reading lately? I've been reading Sour Heart.
Oh, how are you enjoying it? Or are you enjoying it?
Yeah. What else? This book that I got for our secret Shakespeare. Been reading that as well.
Great.
Yeah. And I got Salvage the Bones via my local library on Kindle, so excited about that.
Great. I have not read Jasmine Ward yet.
Yep. I'll let you know how it is.
Yes, please do. For anyone who's watching, Arshia and I are just talking about what we've been reading lately until 6 o'clock when we're going to get started on the story analysis. Yeah, I believe Salvage the Bones includes pit bull fighting. So as you know, I can't read it because of my little problem.
I see.
Yes. I just finished
one eyeball and then it went away. Sorry, commenting on the platform again. So I don't know if we've lost a viewer.
Well, I actually realized I have Curtis Sittenfeld's book with me, so I have her short story in it, so I can actually discuss it from the book.
Wow.
I just hope that it's not different from the New Yorker one. Once I got in a very awkward situation where I was teaching one of Claire Beam's stories to my class. I'd given them an online version, and I was teaching out of her book, and I didn't realize the endings were totally different.
Oh,
it was a real teachable moment. I said, see, even after they're published, stories can go through many iterations.
So true. I've learned recently that that's the case with Alice Munro, that she will she's known to go back and revise stories and then a different version comes out. So you have to know which version you're reading, which
interesting.
Yeah.
That very stressful.
I feel like my head would explode if I knew that I could always revise. I feel like it's too much.
Too much. I think a story should be one and done, personally. Of course, after you've gone through the rigorous revision process with peers and mentors and an editor. But I wouldn't want to feel as though I could just go back to any story I'd ever written in my life when it had been published and change it, because that seems like a recipe for madness.
Yes. Or perhaps you have to get great enough to be able to control such a power.
That is very true. It's very true. Well, I finished reading Barn 8 by Deborah Olin Unferth, which I posted about on Instagram earlier this week. I would say that I liked it, but didn't love it. I think I liked your short stories better. But I do greatly admire her unabashed engagement with philosophy and information that you would not necessarily find in a fiction book. So, I really admire her for that. But it almost felt a little bit too, as though it was trying to be a heist story, but the heist wasn't heisty enough, if you will.
Interesting. Wow.
It was like something really crazy is going to go wrong during this heist, and then the thing that went wrong wasn't that crazy.
Wow.
So, yeah, false expectations.
That's intriguing. I'm excited to check it out.
So we're going to start in just 1 minute. We're just waiting until 6 o'clock so that we can make sure that all our viewers who are planning to come at 6 are indeed going to be there at that time. We're just chatting about books we read recently. gearing up to do a deep dive into the Prairie Wife. And I think I'm probably going to read her whole collection next, since I just finished Barn 8 and I've already read one of the stories in preparation for today.
Well, it looks like we have 3 eyeballs, which is great.
Hello,
And hopefully people have the capacity to write comments. We're still figuring out how that works, but yes.
Yeah, should be starting very soon. Right. Right, well, it's 6 o'clock, so let's go ahead and start this. So as those who are watching probably know, we are Arshia and Emily, the co-founders of the Redbud Writing Project. And we're broadcasting tonight to do a deep dive into a short story. The short story we'll be discussing is The Prairie Wife by Curtis Sittenfeld. And the reason we're doing this specifically is to provide some inspiration and support for people who are working on a short story to submit to our first ever annual Coppice Prize, which is a short story competition that will be open in March. Good evening, George. Thank you for the comments. So we're going to have excuse me, 3 judges who will be judging those stories. There'll be a cash prize and publication on the table. So we're really excited for that. If you're not working on a story for that, we really encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity. So the purpose of tonight is to talk in depth about what works well in the short story, elements that perhaps don't work as well, so that you can think about them for your own work. And at the end of the evening, we will answer questions that you may have either about this story or in general about writing. So feel free to drop in your questions in the comments as the talk goes on, and we'll address them at the end. Or if you would rather wait till the end to drop them in, that is perfectly fine too. All right, so Arshia, do you want to get started?
Yes. So thank you for that introduction, and welcome everybody. We're really excited to talk about this story. We had a lot of fun reading it and kind of discussing it in preparation. So we're going to dive in and get started talking about plot, which is a nice macro level thing to think about. So Emily, do you think you could take us a little bit through the different storylines that you saw in this story?
Sure. So obviously the main storyline here is the story of Kirsten obsessing over Lucy, her ex sort of girlfriend who's now a famous internet celebrity. But then we also have 2 secondary storylines. So that's the main plot engine, I would say. But we also have the secondary storyline of Kirsten and Frank's friendship and how they bonded over their obsession with online celebrities and gossip, which side feels very real. And we'll talk a little bit about how the story engages with internet culture later. And then there's the other secondary storyline of Kirsten and Casey, and this underlying tension where we sense that Casey thinks Kirsten isn't pulling her weight, as with Kirsten not bringing their son violin, and Kirsten sort of chafing against her adult responsibilities and coming up against this wall of middle age. So it's interesting to think about the fact that this story perhaps could have just been about Kirsten obsessing over Lucy. And I could see a version of that story. I think it would be very claustrophobic and perhaps very dark tale about obsession. I'm sure Arshia and I would have loved it because if you know us, you know we love that sort of thing. But as the story stands, these other storylines make the story feel airier and puts different conflict points and points of contrast on this main story. It's also interesting to note that all the storylines converge at the end. So the Kirsten and Lucy conflict finally converges with the simmering conflict between Kirsten and Casey. And while Kirsten ignores Frank's text, which makes us think that she has come to some sort of resolution in terms of her obsession with the world online. Of course, until that last line, which pulls back on that resolution a little bit.
Yeah. And I, when we were discussing this earlier, mentioned that I love that last line because of the realism there. it feels very real, especially as the new year dawns, to vow that we're going to cut back on social media. We're going to change all of our habits. And then you see it with that last line that it's actually really difficult. Zigzag toward progress. And so, sticking with that realism that the story conjures so well. And to me, I think sort of paring back on maybe like too good of a feeling at the end. So I like sort of returning to the darkness a little, which is why I love that last little return to looking at the phone again. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that feels especially true with social media, where it's so easy to get sucked back in because it's quite an addictive pursuit to be on social media. So, Arshia mentioned the ending of the story, and, an ending is really difficult to stick. I think oftentimes in workshop, we read a story and we're like, oh, this is good. Oh, the ending fell flat. And that's oftentimes something writers have to change in revision. But also, this is something to think about when you're working on your stories for the Coppice Prize. Beginnings are also very difficult. And as you probably heard me say, if you've had me in class before, they're the most important part of a story, because if somebody doesn't like you at the beginning, they're not going to stick with you past that. So I think the first paragraph of this story really foreshadows the story in a lot of ways, and that's what a good opening should do. Not be obvious in the ways that it's foreshadowing the story, but do it in subtle ways, so that when you go back to the beginning of the story after having read the whole thing, you say, oh, okay, it really makes sense that was the opening paragraph. So I'm just really quickly going to read that opening paragraph out loud. The understanding is that after Casey's iPhone alarm goes off at 6:15 a.m., Kirsten wakes the boys, nudges them to get dressed, and herds them downstairs, all while Casey is showering. The four of them eat breakfast as a family, deal with teeth brushing and backpacks, and Casey, who is the principal of the middle school in the same district as the elementary school Jack and Ian attend, drives the boys to drop off. Kirsten then takes her shower in the newly quiet house before leaving for work.
Awesome, thank you. So, talking about openings, I think what we observed about this is that theme that runs throughout the story appears right in that opening paragraph. This idea that middle age is a little bit tedious, that this life is sort of feels a bit like drudgery to Kirsten, and that she feels that she's sort of stuck in it. So it puts us sort of right in their sort of ho-hum family life right away. And the other thing I really love is that the contrast between the first and second paragraphs, there's this subtle conflict already simmering with, it starts with the understanding is that, and then in the second paragraph we get the reality is that. And so already, like there is some friction between the two in this household. So really well done there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just thinking about that word reality, and how this story is sort of about the reality or unreality of our online selves and world. And then that starts to get into one of the story's strengths that we saw, which is the satire. Arshia, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I remember reading this story when it first came out, which was like 2017, I think, and it kind of stuck with me, except we'll talk later about the twist that didn't stick with me. But what stuck with me was that it is satirizing the pioneer woman, that sort of, who I knew very little about then and I know very little about now, but I knew enough about it that I knew that this story was sort of being true to its satire. It was hitting these points that made me feel that this was a really sort of skewering portrait of her and of that culture, with details and specificity. I think that's how it achieved it. Emily and I were discussing how does it do that so well, and I'll give you some examples. The fact that she calls the husband, that the husband has this name, it's a stud in overalls, and I just had remembered that I know the pioneer woman has some cutesy name for her husband as well, so the parallel was really good. The fact that we get to see Kirsten breaking down and obsessing over the various tweets and texts. So when she reads Lucy's text where it says, "Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so nervous and excited for Mariana," And she thinks the pseudo nervousness, along with the oh my gosh, not oh my god or even OMG. So she's sort of critiquing it, and we get this insight into her interiority. And it's also really funny. So I think these sort of ways that Sittenfeld is introducing us to this larger than life character and satirizing this sort of phenomenon works really well. And also the other example that stood out to me is the she's always giving recipes for buttermilk biscuits. I think sprinkling these in is sort of how it succeeds. And then we sort of talked about, well, were there ways in which this satire could have gone wrong? And Emily had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I'll also add that it's interesting that the satire, it's a satire of this larger than life character, but there's also some satire of the everyday behavior of somebody who's obsessed with the internet. So, you know, I think we can also, I mean, at least I can see myself in that to some extent. And when you're satirizing something that many of your readers will be able to identify with, it's really important to get those details correct. If the details felt false to us, if I read that and I said, this doesn't seem like someone who's obsessed with Twitter at all, then it would certainly fall flat. Or if the details were too broad, if they weren't specific enough. Oftentimes, you know, if we watch a sitcom and the humor sort of falls flat for us, it's because it's too broad, it's trying to appeal to too many people. It's sort of taking a broad sweep rather than, you know, aiming a really, really specific knife at something. And, you know, we were also imagining back to the satire of the Pioneer Woman, how you know, maybe if it's too closely to this actual person, and Sittenfeld would not have felt as free to invent her own details and sort of, you know, delve into the satire on her own terms. So satire, I think, is definitely something that can go very wrong in a story. Those are some ways we thought about that it could have gone wrong if the story were written by somebody less competent than Sittenfeld.
Absolutely. So something else that we wanted to talk about is backstory and how it is used in this story. So I noted that I was reading this story online, reading it on my screen, and we're talking about social media, so I think this all sort of plays in, but I got to this sentence: in 1994, the summer after their freshman year in college, Kirsten and Lucy were counselors at a camp in northern Minnesota. And as soon as I got to in 1994, I felt this urge to just like open a new tab and click away. And then I was like, wait, why do I feel like that? And I was really into the story and it was very exciting. But I think what triggered that is I felt like, okay, this is backstory now. This is a pause in the forward momentum. And now I should get distracted. So that just made me think about, you know, when to introduce backstory and sort of what it does to the momentum of a story. So something to keep in mind in your own writing about those sort of maybe subtle ways that you can keep pushing your reader to keep reading and ways that might sort of stop that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Arshia and I were talking about this, I had a different reaction to the backstory. I love getting answers to questions. I love getting context. So when I reached the backstory, I got really excited because I knew that I would get some information about what the situation was. And that always feels satisfying to me. So, you know, we have this mystery set up. Kirsten's commute is when she really focuses on whether she has the power to destroy Lucy Hedrick's life. And then on the next page, we get 1994. So I'm like, oh boy, I hope we're going to finally figure out what exactly is going on between these two women and what their history is. So I think that Arshia's and my differing reactions to this portion of the story sort of shows the two different sides of backstory. It definitely does slow down the forward action, but it can also prove satisfying and cathartic. And in most stories, backstory is essential. You're going to have to use some of it. So it's a matter of figuring out, you know, how you can, you know, give your readers the context and satisfaction that they need while also not slowing down the forward action too much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said, and that's sort of the point I think we want to highlight, because I know when I'm writing my own stories, often I'll have like a little bit of action, and then I'm like, now time to give the characters history, and that, you know, I think can really slow things down. So as Emily said, being really cognizant of when you're employing it is really important.
For sure. Yeah, and so another element that we were talking about, like backstory, that is super important to stories but must be wielded with caution is surprise and twists. So Arshia is going to talk a little bit about the degrees of surprise that we get in this story.
Absolutely. So what I was really intrigued by is that we get sort of two surprises at one juncture. When they're in the bar and they're listening to Lucy on the talk show, first we get sort of Kirsten's epiphany that, oh my gosh, maybe um, Lucy is not just faking it all, and maybe she's a real complicated person who genuinely has these emotions and is genuinely trying to do something good for the world by sort of coming out as bisexual and maybe making others feel less alone. All of that. So we get that, which is kind of what we were expecting, right? We were expecting her to learn something in relation to Lucy, but then we also get Frank's reaction, which I was very surprised by, that he's genuinely overcome with emotion, and sort of drops that sort of snarky exterior we've seen all along. So, Frank, who might have otherwise been a one note character, is suddenly complicated in this moment, which I was really intrigued by.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important for characters to surprise your readers, for emotional moments in the story to surprise your readers. And then you probably, if you read the story, guess what we're building up to talking about here, which is that reveal that Casey, who we may have thought throughout the story was Kirsten's husband, is actually Kirsten's wife. So in my eyes, I think that the strength of this reveal is the fact that it changes our understanding of what the story is about. And I think our understanding of what the story is about changes a couple times. So when we first start the story, we think this is about a woman who's obsessed with another random woman online. So we think it's just about internet obsession and how the internet can, allow us to be obsessed with random people we've never met. Then when we find out that Kirsten and Lucy have a history, we start thinking, oh, okay, this story is about queer repression. And Kirsten feels so trapped in her life because she continued on this path of hating herself and her sexuality. And we think that her obsession with Lucy is tied to, her feelings around that. But then we realize, no, Kirsten has been married to a woman this whole time. It's not really about that at all. So we realize that the story is about regret, longing for youth, longing to be seen and to feel important. So, this kind of shift in understanding and expectations, when done well, I think can make the reader feel like the writer is very clever, and can make them feel as though the story is quite dynamic. And I think it plays into something that George Saunders famously said, which is that a story cannot be solved on the same plane on which it begins. So if we start the story thinking it's a story about Kirsten being obsessed with a random woman online, and we end the story thinking that same thing, then the story might not feel as though it has moved enough. And then, of course, though, the potential downside of the twist is that readers might feel cheated and might feel, cheap and might feel as though they have been tricked in a bad way.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this surprise because, as I mentioned, I read this story years ago, and what stuck with me was the satire and not the surprise. So as I was reading it, I was texting Emily like, "Oh my gosh, I just discovered the twist." And I thought, at first I was really delighted. I was like, "Oh, how fun! I've been tricked." It used my own expectations against me, and how clever. But then I also started thinking about it a little bit more deeply, and I still don't know where I land. I'm a little bit torn, thinking about, why does Sittenfeld do this, and sort of what does it mean to us as readers? So it made me think about Kirsten's interiority, and I thought, wouldn't there be times where she naturally thinks about her wife Casey, and maybe even compares her to Lucy, and does Sittenfeld has to omit those in order for this to work, in order for this trick to work, and so I'm I still don't know if it all makes sense to me of why she did it and whether the payoff is worth it. So I'm really curious to hear what the audience has to say when we get to that portion. On the whole, I mean, I really enjoy the story, so I'm thinking yes, but I guess this is sort of returning to this larger discussion of what do you choose to hide from your readers as an author, and for what purposes, and what the payoff is. And I guess the payoff is what Emily is kind of alluding to, which is like, it changes our thematic expectations of the story, then on that plane, it works for me. But you know, we have been manipulated is one way of thinking about it. But sometimes that can be good. So very complicated, don't have an answer. Yes, and Georgia Jack just commented, it is a really creative avoidance of pronouns, now that you pointed out. So yeah.
And a gender neutral name, Casey.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, you know, I feel like this is the kind of trick that wouldn't make it through a writing workshop, but in the hands of a master like Sittenfeld, it is allowed. But I think that this is all to say that, you know, subversion of expectations is really important, but we must tread carefully. It's definitely a high risk, high reward element in a story. And speaking of high risk, high reward elements, something else Arshia mentioned to me about this story is the dialogue at the story's finale. Arshia, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I was thinking about specifically Kirsten and Casey's conversation in bed, when Kirsten is lying there feeling really sort of alone and sad, and then they actually start talking and get really candid with each other. And you know, this whole section that starts with, "It's not that I'm jealous of Lucy Heydrich because she's a rich celebrity," Kirsten says. "It seems awful to be famous now." And then they continue talking about, you know, Kirsten saying, "I don't blame you for not finding me exciting. Why would you? We have," and then Casey responds with, "We have full-time jobs, we have kids." So they have this whole sort of almost like heart-to-heart conversation in bed. And when I read it, I was so impressed because I thought, oh, wow, if I were writing this story, I would probably, my natural instinct would be to avoid having that conversation play out, because it is so emotional, it's so honest, and I would be afraid that if I did it wrong, it would be cheesy and like, oh, look at them, they're having this heartfelt moment, and they're sort of laying out all those conflicts that were so subtly rendered throughout, just like right on the page. So to me, it felt, I was really impressed that Sittenfeld went and sort of articulated these conflicts, and that they didn't feel cheesy on the page. It felt like, it felt real, and it felt like it was payoff. You know, we had been building to some sort of conflict, and we actually get it on the page. And I think often when we're writing, we might try to avoid those moments, and maybe just leave Kirsten lying on the bed feeling sad, and sort of cut away before we get to a conversation. So I thought about that a lot.
Yeah, and I think that kind of frank emotional engagement in literary fiction is perhaps a kind of surprise in and of itself, and is yet another way that the story subverts our expectations, and where we think it's going. Great. Well, so we just each want to quickly talk about one more element of the story, and then we're going to turn it over to any questions that the audience may have. So I just wanted to touch quickly on the themes in the story. I read that Sittenfeld first set out to write this story about thinking about internet voyeurism and social media and our modern relationship with the internet. So as you all know, this theme is heavily present in the story. We see it in many different details and moments. We even see Kirsten reading an article about how smartphones are destroying our attention spans, which feels very true. You know, we all make that kind of reading part of our internet engagement. But then, you know, the story morphs into more universal themes, as we discussed earlier. And it's interesting to think that, you know, the story appeared originally in the New Yorker and then was reprinted in Best American Short Stories a few years ago. And I think that's partly because people find it very exciting to read literature that tackles very of the moment issues, especially since, you know, the internet has created such a sea change in many aspects of our society, and most writers are on the internet to some extent. So I think we all find it very exciting and interesting to see literature start to engage with these changes. But then it's also necessary that that literature, to truly be enduring, should feel broader and more expansive. So that somebody who is not living in America in 2017 when the story came out can still relate to it. So it's interesting to think about how Sittenfeld had this one theme in mind, and then as she wrote, she sort of discovered this other theme. And it's really important not to be like, I must stick with this original theme and hammer it home, no matter where the story is trying to take me. To allow your story to develop more naturalistically than that. And also to think about if you're writing a story that's very, very of this moment, how can you make it a little bit more universal so that in 10 years, it wouldn't necessarily feel dated and completely unrelatable.
Absolutely. The final aspect of the story that I wanted to talk about is thinking about the prose. And as I was just sort of scrolling through it, there was this line that really jumped out at me in terms of prose. So it says, at the time, fake casually, fake confusedly, Kirsten said, with who? And this is in her response to a girl asking her if she and Lucy are like an item or a thing. At the camp they're both at. And then I thought, well, interesting that Sittenfeld uses, fake casually, fake confusedly, because it's kind of awkward wording if you think about it. It says exactly what it means, so it's effective. But if I were writing this, I might have resisted saying it so plainly and maybe tried to say like Kirsten scrunched her brow or something along those lines, like showing it, which had me just sort of thinking about the prose of this story and um, what Emily ultimately pointed out, which is that it's not like a really beautifully written story. It's not lyrical by any means. It just sort of gets across what is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I totally agree. I was thinking about it Arshia, when you brought that up, and I'm the kind of reader that is typically drawn to really beautiful prose, but that's not really why I like this story. I don't think it's that beautifully written. I think, as Arshia said, it gets the job done. It tells us this tale of this woman and what's going on with her in her life and her obsession and her marriage. But I think that this is a reminder that a story does not have to be mind-blowing in every single category in order to be successful, and even in order to be very lauded as the story was. The story succeeds on many other levels besides the prose, and maybe that's okay. So if your stories are wonderful, in 4 categories, and in categories 5 and 6 they just get the job done, then maybe that's okay, because categories 1 through 4 will be where your story really shines.
Absolutely. I guess the other sort of related thought is if Sittenfeld had tried and sort of gone for like very lyrical prose, it might have sort of muddled some of the other things we're talking about. It's a very, as Emily was saying, of the moment story. And I am having a hard time picturing how that would be written in a way that feels like very stirring and moving, but perhaps it can be done. And if you guys know of stories that do that, please tell us.
Yes. The sibilant drumbeat of Twitter. Coming up with stuff in my mind here. Anyway, so that's I think all we have for the story. So we would love to answer any questions that any of you have. You can just go ahead and drop them into the comments feature of the live video. You could ask questions about the story. You could make a comment about the story if you'd like, and we'll read it to the group. You could ask a question about writing in general, or if you have a logistical question about the Coppice Prize, then feel free to ask that as well.
All right, and we'll just wait, as I'm sure everybody is clattering away at their keywords. as we're waiting, I will, oh, no, we've got
Oh,
one.
so Chuck has asked, was I the only one that thought Frank came off as a bit one-dimensional?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting
Mm-hmm.
point. I was gonna say with Frank's one dimensionalness, I felt that way until that point where he sort of feels so deeply about Lucy's revelation, and you sort of get to understand that like maybe he has these like hidden wells of pain that he has been coping with, as a gay man in today's society. And so I thought it opened it up a bit more, but I would agree that he's certainly not,
Mm-hmm.
we don't know much more about
Mm-hmm.
him. And so it's hard to sort of give him
Mm-hmm.
more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. For those who can't see the chat, Chuck added, I felt like he was there to serve as a device more than a character. Um, and I suppose the generous interpretation of that could be, well, Kirsten sees him as a device in her life. He's fulfilling one specific role. So if we had Sittenfeld here to ask her, maybe she could say, well, I did that on purpose. But one could also read it as he's just underdeveloped. He's just there to serve a specific role in the story. Susan has added, agreed, Frank as one-dimensional, but perhaps that was commentary on the internet, social media interaction being one-dimensional compared to real-world interactions. So yeah, I think that's another really good interpretation of that as well. And George has posted a comment as well. George writes, I like what the story does with Casey's gender reveal. If it had begun with establishing her as Kirsten's wife, then I would have looked at the writing one way. Once I learned that Casey is female, then I thought first that I had missed something. But then, rereading the story, I began to look at my own assumptions about why I assumed she was he. It pulled me into the story in an amazing way. Um, yeah, I think that's a really good point, George. And I think that sort of answers this question that Arshia and I brought up of why did Sittenfeld do this? If she just did it for the twist factor, well, it feels kind of clever, but also perhaps kind of like cheating. But if she did that to force the audience to examine our own assumptions about why most of us, or all of us, assumed that Casey was a man, then that's a very good reason to do that, I think.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. And Susan points out that Kirsten, this is returning to the Frank question, wasn't interested in being friends with him until he would mean girl about Lucy with him.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a good point, and sort of relating to what Emily was saying earlier about it feels very real in a way because I think maybe, a lot of us can think of relationships where like we bonded over the one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we have in common. And I also like the times where Kirsten starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable about it, where like Frank is also then mean about other celebrities, other women celebrities, and she's like, oh, I only feel this way about Lucy, really. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I love how she and Frank become super close over this one. Like, it feels so real to me, this like shared workplace boredom, meanness about something on the internet that will like really, really, really bond people. So that element of it certainly felt very relatable to me. Um, Very interesting. Yeah. George writes, the author's first name is Curtis. I assume she was male too. I'm sure this is life introduced into art. Yeah, that's very true. I would imagine that Curtis has had many people mistake her for a man throughout her life.
Let's see. Susan writes, what do you feel are the components which most helped of the moment issue story also be more broadly relatable and not confined to just contemporary issue aspects? Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's the focus on the details of what Kirsten views as the drudgery of her life. That opening paragraph that's all about waking up early, the logistics of getting the kids to school. And then throughout, when we see, like, she just wants to go to the bar with Frank, but she's got to bring her violin to the kid. To me, we've seen these themes of, in the 50s and 60s of, bored housewives or men who feel trapped by their professions or what have you. When going back to the 19th century, we see Madame Bovary feeling trapped in her boring life. So these are themes that or that theme of feeling trapped and feeling a sense of drudgery, I think can be traced back to the advent of the novel, really. And so I think the fact that that's so present in there, as well as the fact that it's so relatable, I think most people have felt trapped by something, some routine at some point in their life, whether it's having to go to high school every day or having, feeling trapped by the expectations of parenthood or what have you. So to me, the fact that that theme is so universal, something that appears so much in fiction, saves the story from feeling like it's just a story about Twitter or what have you.
Yeah. And I think very closely related to me is this idea of like jealousy. She's thinking like Lucy is famous and everybody adores her. And I think, to me, it's bringing in what social media amplifies, which is like we can now be jealous all of the time in a very public way. But it's jealousy, I think, like Emily is saying, is a theme that you could find in novels from millennia. And so it's taking that, it's using social media, and it's really amplifying it. Which is really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, it shows how this universal or near universal feeling of jealousy is enacted in this specific time period. And as Arshia said, is amplified by these new tools at our disposal. George has a question for us about the Compass Prize. He asks, besides length, which is 4,000 words, are there any other requirements or limitations for entries, genre or lack of specific genre, theme, etc.? It is a fiction contest. So if you're planning to submit a nonfiction piece, make sure to tweak it a little bit and make it into autofiction. Other than that, there are not any specific genre requirements, but we do encourage people who want to enter to research the three judges a little bit. So Arshia and I will be reading all the stories that come in and picking 10 semifinalists. And then we will send those 10 off to the three authors, who are Rachel Benning-Hales, Jill McCorkle, and Claire Beans. So it's a really good idea to, we have their bios up on our website, but if you read a little bit more about what kinds of things they write, then you could get a sense of what kinds of things they might like to read and think about what might be a good fit for them. But there are no official specific requirements or limitations vis-a-vis genre, except the fact that it must be a fiction story of 4,000 words or under.
Absolutely. So Sneha had a comment on tense. She says, on a mechanics level, using the present tense can often feel overdone, but it really worked here, maybe because of the ephemeral nature and immediate gratification, or not, of social media and Twitter. I think that is a great observation. Present tense, I think, is hard because you don't have that sort of looking back and reflecting that can naturally happen from the past tense. But it feels, what's the word? Immediate, as Sneha was saying. So I think, trying to think how I would feel if the story was in past tense. I might not notice it, I guess, because most stories are. But I think this was the right choice here.
And, the past tense does imply reflection and looking back on something. And as Neha points out, that's not really what social media is about. It's about living in the flashes of moments that social media gives to you. And I don't really want Kirsten's reflections on what it was like to be obsessed with Lucy on Twitter. I really like just being there with her and experiencing it vicariously through her.
Yes. Oh, I will say one thing that occurred to me now that we're talking about tense is the time period that the story is compressed into, because one thing I think about is how repetitive stories of obsession can get. So imagine if we had then I spent the next day on Twitter, and then the next day I was also on Twitter. It could get kind of old, but we have sort of her morning routine, and then this sort of mini crisis with the violin, the bar, and then that night, and that's basically it, and plus the backstory. So I think that compression was a really masterful move, and perhaps one you all could consider if you're feeling like your story is getting repetitive, or like it doesn't have that momentum that you want.
For sure. And it's really smart that the story takes place on a day when something big is going to happen in Lucy's career. So we automatically know that this is like a special day, that that we should be hearing about as readers. So yeah, I think Arshia is really right about that compression and sticking to that one moment. We don't need like a setup day where we establish that Kirsten's obsessed with Lucy and then we get to the big day. Like we can just stick with the big day. Susan notes, interesting about tense. The story plays with Kirsten's notions of then versus now, is underscoring her feeling of being non-special, and is asked Lucy then or Lucy now. Yeah, Susan, I love how you combined that with that question that Casey asks her in that ending dialogue. And yeah, I mean, to some extent, this story is about past versus present and who the characters used to be versus who they are now. So I think tense is a really important component of the story to discuss and think about, since it's so thematically tied up with, memory and, again, who we were when we were young versus who we are now.
Yeah, so any other thoughts or questions? We do really appreciate you all joining us.
Yeah, and can I say that you guys are great. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions and comments and analysis. Everyone is such a great reader and so good at pointing out aspects of the story that are fruitful and important to think about. So thank you. Thank you for the comments. Anybody have any really quick last questions? Thank you, George says, thank you. Thank you, George, and thank you so much to everybody who watched and to anybody who is watching after the fact. We definitely hope to see all of your work in our inboxes come March. And just a quick reminder that our classes, our first classes of 2021 start up on next Sunday, a week from this coming Sunday. So we hope to see some of you or all of you in the classes.
Yes, and I will just mention as a last note, if you enjoyed our fun back and forth dynamic here, we are teaching a co-taught class called Writing Feminist Works. So that's one I would plug and encourage you to check out. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe and have a great night.
Bye.